Today, turning freedom down another notch. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, well, latest post covering finance and property news. One of the critical aspects of our freedoms in Australia and other Western countries is to be able to hold our elected representatives and the machinery of government and its associated agencies to account. We're actually facing another battle as Australia's Freedom of Information, the FOI legislation, is on the brink of significant reform through the Freedom of Information Amendment Bill 2025. Key changes include widening cabinet document exemptions, introducing application fees, requiring applicants to identify themselves, and to implement stricter processing caps. They say that the bill is aimed to modernize the framework and to address system inefficiencies, but it's drawn criticism for potentially increasing secrecy and hindering public access to information. The government has cited potential security implications and systems inefficiencies, such as the rise of bot-generated requests, as reasons for the changes, though evidence for the latter has been questioned. But critics argue that the reforms will hinder public access to government information, make it harder for whistleblowers to remain protected, and weaken transparency and accountability. Now, it's possible the bill will get stalled, just as the misinformation and disinformation bill did last year. But it does seem to signal the government's intent to turn down transparency another notch. So this is a big deal. Now, it may come to many as no surprise that sometimes the government says one thing when they're actually doing something else, or at least they're only telling part of the true picture. In our Interests of the People channel on YouTube, John Adams and I have been probing aspects of process corruption where government officials, for various reasons, drive to outcomes that are not necessarily in the public interest. Our latest spat with the ABC is a good example. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, to quote Louis Brandeis from a 1913 Harper Weekly article entitled What Publicity Can Do. But it was an image that had been in his mind for decades. 20 years earlier, in a letter to his fiancée, Brandeis had expressed an interest in writing a sort of companion piece to his influential article on the right of privacy. But this time, he would focus on the duty of publicity. He had been thinking, he wrote, about the wickedness of people shielding wrongdoers and passing them off, or at least allowing them to pass themselves off as honest men. And he then proposed a remedy. If the broad light of day could be let in upon man's actions, it would purify them as the sun disinfects. Interestingly, at that time, the word publicity referred to something like what we think of as public relations, as well as to the practice of making information widely available to the public. That latter definition sounds a lot like what we now mean by transparency. Indeed, underpinning democracy is the right to know, and within that framework, freedom of information, the ability to force disclosure, is a critical democratic right. As the Human Rights Law Centre puts it, a well-functioning freedom of information system is vital to a healthy, transparent and accountable democracy. Whether it's individuals seeking information about how their personal matters are determined by a government body, a journalist seeking documents to write a public interest story, or a civil society organisation looking to hold the government to account, freedom of information requests guarantee the public's right to know. Now, Michelle Rowland, who was appointed Attorney General following the election after former occupant Mark Dreyfus was dumped from the ministry in a factional execution, is staring at a potential defeat on this high-profile measure, her bill to overhaul the Freedom of Information regime. Yes, this is the same Michelle Rowland who less than a year ago as Communications Minister had a humiliating retreat as she then conceded the government's sweeping legislation to combat misinformation and disinformation would not proceed because the numbers were not there to get it through. While the government claimed the plan would have held big tech platforms to account in having to deal with false information, it would have ushered in an unprecedented level of transparency. It said opponents saw it as the government wanting to censor the internet. They retreated, but then found another way via the age restrictions legislation, which is now coming into force. So this goes to form. Already under the Albanese government, according to a recent report, the Australian government is refusing freedom of information requests at a rate not seen for a decade, prompting concerns for transparency and accountability. Data held by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the watchdog overseeing the FOI system, revealed that the proportion of FIA requests being completely refused has shot up to 27% in the December 2024 quarter. That's the highest level since at least 2014-2015, according to historical records. The OAIC said it was aware of the rising refusal rate and is monitoring the situation. There are some clear opportunities for improvements for the Commonwealth FOI system that we're alive to as the regulator and monitoring, a spokesperson said. This includes refusal rates. The skyrocketing refusal rates prompted concerns about transparency, and advocates for transparency, including Transparency International Australia, said the FOI system was an essential part of accountability and integrity, but refusal rates suggested important information about the functioning of government is being kept from everyday Australians. The Commonwealth has improved its performance in other areas of the FOI system. They said in the last 3 years, it has improved the speed of decision making, partly reversing some significant declines between 2019 and 2022. It's now processing around 75% of FOIs within the required time limit, up from 70% in 21-22. The federal government is also releasing more FOIs in full than its state and territory counterparts, and it's continuing to reduce the cost charged to applicants for processing FOIs, but of course that could all change. The proposed reforms to FIOs are contained in the Freedom of Information Amendment Bill 2025 to amend the law relating to access to information and for related purposes. Second reading was moved on the same day. On the 4th of September 2025, the bill was referred to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislation Committee, whose report is expected by the 3rd of December 2025. The desire to restrict transparency is, of course, not mentioned in the explanatory memorandum which accompanied the bill. The bill is the most significant reform proposed to the FOI Act since the 2013 review of the same Act, also known as the Hawke Review, and has made 40 recommendations. This bill seeks to implement a number of those recommendations. Now, the government argues that the FOI system has become expensive, unworkable, gobbling up public service resources, and open to exploitation by bots and for foreign players. It insists its changes would strengthen the system, ensuring genuine requests are prioritised while saving the taxpayers money on frivolous and automated requests. Recent Senate estimate hearings revealed that the government was unconvincing when pressed to substantiate some of those claims, for example, about the problem of bots clogging the system. The government tabled 2 articles from America and a reference to similar concerns occurring in Australia with no further evidence. Actually, ironically, the government claimed it could not release other documents on the basis of, wait for it, cabinet confidentiality. In Senate estimates, Shoebridge asked the Secretary of the Attorney General's Department, Catherine Jones, whether the proposal for the FOI reforms was generated from a department or from somewhere else in government. Jones replied, I don't know whether I would attribute them to coming out of anywhere. There has been ongoing discussion across government. Another officer added that the current bill was developed by the department, but there's been a track record of reviews and recommendations. The new Attorney General is left carrying the troubled legislation, but perhaps she's not seen by insiders as the prime driver of it. FOI is something that all ministers and departmental secretaries, the latter colloquially dubbed the Black Cabinet, have an interest in and views about. For many bureaucrats and ministers, FOI is at best a nuisance and at worst a potential threat. Albanese, who told Parliament the FOI system currently was not working for anyone, will be pushing to get the legislation through via a deal with the Liberals. But a well-placed source observed the Prime Minister has never liked FOI. Interestingly, a group of lower and upper house crossbenchers have joined forces at a news conference recently with the Centre for Public Integrity, the CPI. That's an independent think tank to condemn the bill, and they're calling for its withdrawal and an independent inquiry into FOI to be set up. The CPI goes to the core issue in relation to access to information about government operations, saying the bill represents a radical shift in Australia's FOI culture. That shift, reflected in the bill's objective, is from a focus on the Australian community's access to information, promoting democracy through public participation and increased scrutiny, to a newly introduced balance between this and effective government. In summary, the proposed changes would firstly broaden the scope of documents exempt from release, particularly those relating to Cabinet, making it easier for agencies to withhold information. The reforms would introduce application fees for the first time. Anonymous FOI requests would no longer be permitted, requiring applicants to identify themselves and potentially exposing them to retribution. And the bill seeks to reduce inefficiencies with stricter processing caps and other changes to address, quote, abuses of process. So the bill aims to modernize the FOI framework by amending the Freedom of Information Act of 1982, the Australian Information Commissions Act of 2010, and the Public Interest Disclosures Act of 2013. The CPI says the bill weakens the FOI Act's pro-disclosure foundations by expanding cabinet and deliberative process exemptions, introducing fees, and removing anonymous applications. Those changes would make it harder for journalists, parliamentarians, and citizens to scrutinise government decisions and could silence the voices of vulnerable or marginal applicants. The CPI calls for the bill's withdrawal and for a comprehensive independent review of the FOI Act. Its blueprint for reform recommends structural fixes, stronger oversight of FOI decision-making, better training and resourcing of officials, reduced costs, and safeguards against abuse of exemptions. This is another example of freedoms being ripped away in Australia and of government overreach. It's interesting to note, in contrast, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression has outlined international best practice that should be reflected in FOI legislation. It includes access to information held by public bodies as a fundamental right and should be presumed available to all individuals and organisations without requiring a specific interest or reason. Any refusal must be justified by the public body and demonstrated to meet clearly defined and limited exceptions. The current trick, of course, is claiming national security or commercial interests or cabinet as an excuse. And they go on to say that the right to information should override conflicting laws, which must be amended or repealed, and all legislation must align with this principle of freedom. They go on to say that public bodies must proactively and regularly publish information of significant public interest, limited only by reasonable constraints, such as the availability of resources and capacity. Costs are often cited as a reason to refuse, of course. Public bodies must promote transparency, accountability, and public participation to build trust and strengthen democracy. They should educate the public, train officials, protect whistleblowers, and report annually to Parliament on progress, challenges, and plans to improve access to information, not turn it off. And access to public information should generally be provided free or at minimal cost, limited to actual reproduction and delivery expenses. Fees should be waived or greatly reduced for requests involving personal information, matters of public interest, or applicants with incomes below the national poverty line. And whistleblowers who report wrongdoing must be legally protected from legal, administration, or employment-related consequences. And of course, there is a litany of whistleblowers in Australia who have been caught and prosecuted for releasing information which is actually in the public interest. So this is a critical debate, and one which is going to run through into 2026. But it does mark the government's card. They want to turn down transparency and sunlight. They want to turn down disclosure. They want to work in the dark, which is precisely heading in the wrong direction. We need more openness and transparency, not less. So it's a good time to remind your local elected representatives of the importance of freedom of information and that this should not be turned down, but in fact sunlight remains the best disinfectant. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.